Hey guys, tonight we're wading slowly, gently, into the cool, wet paddies of ancient Korea. Crickets are chirping, but it's the frogs you hear most clearly, croaking from every bank and shadow. The air is heavy with the scent of damp earth and the slow swirling promise of rain. Somewhere behind you, a farmer kneels barefoot in the soft mud, head tilted, eyes closed, not praying, exactly, but listening. He's not checking a forecast. He's waiting for frogs to speak. Because out here, long before satellite maps or glowing apps with cartoon thunderclouds, people learned to listen to the amphibians. Frogs weren't just part of the scenery. They were instruments. Instruments that measured rain before it arrived, sang warnings in the night, and sometimes predicted entire seasons based on one single song. Of course, if you tried to run a farm that way now, you'd probably go bankrupt before your first planting. You probably wouldn't survive a single monsoon. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with where you're listening from, and what time it is, rain or no rain. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's still dark as I step down into the fields. My sandals are soaked within seconds. The frogs are already singing. 1,000 tiny choruses rising from every angle. Some are rapid-fire chirps like clicking pebbles. Others drawn-out baritone croaks that almost seem to echo inside your chest. A strange concert. Not random, not chaotic. Organized. Or at least it feels that way when you're standing very still in the middle of it. The year is somewhere around the mid-Joseon period, maybe 1500 CE, maybe 1600. Time blurs out here. What matters more is season. And tonight it's almost early summer. That delicate tipping point when the rice must go in the water. And everything depends on the rains arriving on time. Which is why I'm not alone. A few meters away, an old farmer with rolled-up sleeves crouches low beside a shallow stream. He's got a reed in his mouth, chewing, not playing. His eyes are fixed on a cluster of sedge grass where two small green frogs perch like gossiping monks. Every few seconds, he nods. Another croak. Another nod. I edge closer. He doesn't look up. Wet month, he says simply, and spits the reed into the mud. They've started early. 3 days ahead. He doesn't mean the frogs are early risers. He means the rain. The frogs are saying the monsoon will start 3 days sooner than the elders thought. Now, to your ears, that may sound like wishful thinking, or folklore. But here's the thing. This man's entire planting schedule, and the fate of his family's rice, depends on whether those frogs are telling the truth. It's a delicate game of interpretation. By morning, the frogs are quiet. Not silent exactly, just less theatrical. I wake to soft splashes from a nearby irrigation canal, where a young boy is tossing bits of millet into the water, not for fish, but for luck. His grandmother sits a few steps behind him, combing her hair with a carved wooden pick. Both of them listen, but not for words. For hints. Because in this village, a change in frog behavior isn't just curious. It's urgent. The frogs are, in their own way, the village's very first farmers. Tiny prophets in slimy suits. The boy points to a stone outcropping where a green frog sits with its mouth wide open and unmoving. That one's lazy, he says. Doesn't sing much. His grandmother tsks softly. He sings when it matters. There's a confidence in her tone that makes me stop. How many years do you have to listen to frogs before you start treating them like coworkers? She pats the ground beside her and tells me stories. Slow, half-whispered ones, sticky with morning dew. About farmers who could tell the exact week the rains would start by the volume of a frog's croak. About uncles who carried frogs in gourds to new fields like little barometers. about grandfathers who kept frog journals, noting every peep and silence like sacred text. And yes, most of these stories end with a rice harvest either saved or ruined. Because out here, frogs meant rice and rice meant life. Let's zoom out for a moment. Modern historians looking back at this practice call it everything from folk meteorology to ethnozoology, which is just a very expensive way of saying people using animals to figure out the weather. And frogs were among the most useful creatures for this because they responded quickly, almost too quickly, to changes in humidity, pressure, and temperature. You see, frogs don't have waterproof skin. Their entire body breathes through their skin, which means when it's dry, they're in danger. And when it's about to rain, they know before we do. Sometimes hours before. Sometimes even days if the pressure drops far enough. So when you're living in a time with no barometers, frogs become your personal pressure sensors. And it wasn't just Korea. Similar traditions existed in parts of China, Vietnam, and even pre-colonial West Africa. But here in the valleys of Joseon, Korea, frog watching became an art form. Farmers developed their own hyperlocal rules. If frogs croaked in the late afternoon, rain would come at night. If they croaked all day but fell silent after sunset, dry weather. If they chirped in unison, it meant steady rains. If they took turns, storms. If they climbed higher than usual, up tree roots, walls, even rooftops, then heavy monsoons were likely on the way. Historians still argue whether these interpretations were truly accurate or just a kind of agrarian placebo. A confidence booster. A way to feel more in control of the chaos of farming. But honestly, when you're soaked in sweat, ankle deep in leeches, and betting your entire livelihood on a 3-week weather window, you'll take anything that helps. We move down the slope to a broader view of the rice paddies. The boy runs ahead, hopping like the very frogs he was watching. I watch his small feet splash through water that's clear enough to see tiny tadpoles wriggling below. And then it hits me. Frog behavior wasn't just observed. It was woven into the entire farming calendar. In some villages, planting wouldn't begin until a certain number of frogs had been seen mating. Others waited until frog spawn appeared in designated ditches, as if the amphibians were the first ones checking in for duty. One record from 18th century, Anong describes a ritual where children would gather frogs in shallow baskets and parade them through the fields while chanting a simple line, "Tell the rain it's time." Strange? Yes. But also weirdly touching. You start to realize that for these communities, frogs weren't just little creatures, they were collaborators, seasonal partners, freelancers, if you will. Even the language used reflected this. In rural dialects, frogs weren't called animals but voices, as in, "Have the voices spoken yet?" Or, "The voices are asleep this week." It wasn't mystical, it was matter of fact. Still, there's a lot we don't know. There are only a few surviving written records of frog forecasting methods, mostly scribbled in personal farming logs or embedded in oral folklore. No master manual. No nationwide guide. Just generations of intuition passed down knee to knee. Sometimes through dreams, sometimes through gossip, often through mothers humming frog songs while cooking barley porridge. And yet, for all its informality, it worked. One French missionary traveling through Korea in the 1800s noted in his journal that rural farmers seem to know the rain's arrival with a precision that surpasses our instruments, and they claim it is the frogs who tell them. He sounded bemused, not impressed. But his journal also mentions being caught in a surprise downpour 2 days later, one the locals had already prepared for. Back in the fields, the sun has now pushed fully into the sky. Mist rises off the paddies like steam from a bath. Frogs hop lazily between reeds, their urgency gone. For now, I crouch beside one that's no bigger than my thumb. The skin pulses slightly as it breathes. Quiet. Still. watching me as much as I watch it. A few more hours, and the farmers will start transplanting their seedlings. But they'll only do it if the frogs croak again tonight. That's the rhythm here. Frog speaks. Farmer moves. No charts. No apps. Just instinct, intuition, and a very squishy weather report. And if the frogs stop speaking, well, we'll get there. The sun is high now, filtering through a veil of thin clouds that weren't there an hour ago. Not quite ominous, just quietly expectant, like the sky is inhaling. I trail behind a narrow procession. 3 men, 1 boy, 2 oxen, and a low wooden cart rattling over the dikes. The cart's contents? Barrels of seedlings and a small ceramic jar filled with rice wine, for offerings, not drinking. At least not yet. But what's striking isn't the cargo. It's the sound. Or rather, the absence of one. The frogs are quiet again. Their croaking, so vivid last night, has faded into occasional gurgles, like someone mumbling in their sleep. This doesn't go unnoticed. One of the farmers, a wiry man with a sun-lined face and a straw hat that could double as a parasol, stops walking. He points toward a stone culvert where frogs usually cluster. Not a single belly rumble, he mutters. The others glance back, mildly concerned. See, this is the strange tension at the heart of frog-based weather forecasting. The frogs can predict rain, yes, but their silence is harder to read. Does it mean calm, delay, or something worse? In elite circles, people had their own theories. At the height of the Joseon dynasty, even royal astrologers kept frog ponds in court gardens. Some of these jebi, a name meaning prophetic frogs, were considered spiritually significant. One record mentions a particularly loud toad in the king's garden whose croaks allegedly aligned with seasonal floods for 5 years straight. When it died, a court official mourned it with a short poem. You can imagine how well that landed in the next cabinet meeting. But the fascination with frogs wasn't just about their croaks. In some circles, they were bred selectively, not for color or size, but for voice clarity. Breeders hoped to raise frogs whose songs would serve as more reliable signals. There's even a rumor, historians still argue whether it's real or a beautifully exaggerated footnote, that a noble family once gifted a rain-predicting frog to the king in a lacquered box. The gift was reportedly well received. The frog was not. It escaped into the palace kitchens and disrupted a royal banquet by croaking through the soup. But that level of frog devotion wasn't limited to royals. Here in the countryside, frogs had different titles: mud singers, rice guardians, even sky listeners. Families passed down nicknames for certain frog species. The baker frog that only sang at dusk, the drummer frog whose calls came before thunder. These weren't scientific labels. They were relationship names, familiar, slightly reverent, and almost always tied to a story about weather. We stop for a quick break near a shaded stream, where the air smells thick with moss and old water. One of the men pulls a frog from a nearby puddle, not roughly, just carefully, like he's holding a peach pit that might wake up. He peers at it, sniffs. Still wet, he says. And here comes one of the more unusual tools in the frog weather toolkit: frog skin. Farmers believed that the texture and moisture of a frog's skin could indicate atmospheric pressure. If it was tacky and clammy, the air was dry and stable. But if it felt slick, almost oiled, then rain was near. This wasn't just superstition, though obviously there's some squishiness, pun intended, to the logic. Even modern zoologists note that amphibian skin does become more hydrated and sensitive when pressure drops, especially before storms. The frogs hydrate in preparation. They're like walking, hopping humidity meters. Some families took this a step further. They gently press a frog's belly and watch the reaction. If the frog kicked wildly, rain. If it didn't move, dry spell. Again, fringe, yes, but deeply believed. One 17th century farming diary, full of these kinds of records, describes an old woman who could read the wind's intention based on how frogs blinked at her. I don't know whether to be skeptical or incredibly impressed. Probably both. That diary also includes an unsettling anecdote. A year when the frogs stopped croaking entirely for a whole month. Villagers called it the quiet curse. The rains came late, then all at once, flooding the lower paddies. One elder blamed it on a neighbor who'd built his house too close to the frog ponds. Others whispered about a local spirit offended by noise. Historians, they suggest maybe a predator, like snakes or feral cats, had disturbed the frog population, or perhaps disease. Amphibian die-offs are still a mystery in many parts of the world. But regardless of cause, the silence shook people. Because frogs were more than just cute rain indicators. They were reassurance. The croaking said, "All is well. The cycle continues. Rain is coming in due time." When that sound vanished, it was like someone unplugged the heartbeat of the land. Back on the trail, the boy from earlier has joined us again. He's got a reed flute and he's trying badly to mimic the croaks he heard the night before. The older men chuckle, but one warns him not to do that too loudly. Apparently, mimicking frog songs used to be taboo in some villages, especially during planting week. You didn't want to confuse the spirits, or worse, offend the frogs. Yet not everyone followed that rule. There are tales of young tricksters, usually boys, who learned to imitate frog calls so well they could fool half the valley into planting a week early. One got whipped. One got applauded. One became a court entertainer, believe it or not. And while that may sound like mischief, it actually reveals something bigger. How seriously these signals were taken. People were willing to alter entire crop cycles, literal lifelines, based on what they thought the frogs were saying. Think about that. If someone told you today to cancel your vacation because a squirrel just gave you vibes, you'd probably laugh them out of the room. But when the frogs spoke here, you listened. You didn't always understand, but you listened. As we reach the paddies again, the boy pauses, cupping his hands to his mouth. He croaks softly, one long nasal note. Somewhere in the grass, a real frog answers. Everyone freezes. Then, slowly, the croaking resumes. Faint but rising, like rain tapping in the distance. We stay frozen for a moment. Every head tilted slightly toward the reeds, as though tuning into a static-filled radio channel. One frog croaks, then another, and another. The air trembles with the sound, like someone brushing a broom across a wooden floor. It's not music, not really, but it's rhythmic, comforting, like the land is exhaling again. The boy grins. See? They're not lazy. The older farmer just shakes his head and mutters. Cheeky frogs, always waiting for an audience. There's something deeply theatrical about it, actually, as if the frogs have been holding rehearsals in secret, only to break into full voice the moment they feel us watching again. But here in ancient Korea, this isn't entertainment. It's revelation. We move to the planting site, a flooded terrace bordered by willow branches and low stone ridges. Everything gleams with water. The seedlings, tied in bundles with straw twine, float like little bouquets of grass, bobbing patiently, before anyone begins planting. Though, the eldest farmer reaches into his sash and pulls out a clay whistle shaped like a frog. He blows a low, wavering note that fades into the wet air. It's symbolic, a gesture to the sky listeners who've granted their forecast. A small, sleepy thank you. This moment's important because it shows the intersection between practical farming and mythic reverence. Frogs weren't just tools. They were messengers. And messages require acknowledgement. In Korean shamanism, *muism* specifically, frogs have long been associated with water spirits, fertility, and transformation. The mudong, shaman, might use frog effigies in rituals, or imitate frog croaks during trance states to summon rain. Some wore robes embroidered with amphibians, and their ceremonial chants included phrases like, "Let the frogs speak for the sky," and it wasn't all metaphor. In some regions, the arrival of frogs in spring was literally considered the first divine sign that the year had begun. Their croaks marked the awakening of the earth. In households, if a frog wandered in during the first rains, it was considered deeply auspicious, though good luck required you to gently usher it out using only your breath. No touching. The logic being, if the frog came with news, you didn't manhandle the messenger. The planting begins in near silence, broken only by the splash of feet and the rustle of rice shoots sliding into the mud. Each farmer moves with fluid precision, the rhythm not unlike a Tai Chi routine. They space each seedling with care, not just for growth, but in line with old folk geometry believed to optimize water spirit flow. And as they work, the frogs sing louder. I swear, the croaking aligns with the planting steps. Maybe it's coincidence. Or maybe the frogs are genuinely reacting to human movement, vibrations in the water, the scent of disturbed earth, the sounds of splashing limbs. Whatever it is, it works. The scene feels choreographed, ancient, intimate. The boy from earlier stops to watch a cluster of frogs hop up a small embankment, out of the flooded terrace. "Climbing frogs," he says, eyes wide. "That means it'll rain twice." I arch an eyebrow. "Twice?" He nods. "A short rain, then a longer one." Turns out that's a genuine belief. Farmers sometimes interpreted frog migration directions as weather trajectories. If frogs climbed uphill, the rain would be strong. If they stayed low, mild drizzle. If they scattered, the weather was fickle. And if they all climbed together in the same direction, that was practically a bulletin announcement. Some researchers speculate this may stem from frogs instinctively seeking higher ground before heavy storms. Again, linked to pressure changes. Their sensitive skin detects the shift, and they head for shelter. Still, historians disagree. Some argue that humans simply projected patterns onto random frog behavior. Others believe centuries of observation built a surprisingly accurate system, refined through trial and error. The debate continues. Were ancient Korean farmers natural-born biologists? Or were they deeply poetic, connecting with the land through metaphor and repetition? Honestly, I don't think it matters, because whether you interpret the frogs literally or spiritually, their role in this culture is clear. They weren't just background noise. They were trusted cohabitants of the agricultural rhythm, a slimy, warty link between human hands and skybound hopes. By midday, the sun disappears behind a mass of rolling clouds. Not dark, not dramatic, just heavy. Like the sky had one too many rice cakes and now needs a nap. The frogs get louder. Urgent. Some almost sound annoyed. Tonight, one of the farmers mutters. They're saying it now. Definitely tonight. And he's probably right. The smell of rain is in the air. That sweet mineral scent that arrives just ahead of a summer downpour. Petrichor, modern scientists call it. But here, no one needs a fancy label. Just a frog chorus and a well-trained nose. One woman nearby adds a practical detail I hadn't heard yet. If they croak at the same pitch for more than an hour, it'll be a soft rain. She then turns back to her planting like she just quoted a universal truth. Another farmer, overhearing, pipes up, "Unless the moon's waxing." Laughter. Not sarcastic, just familiar. A sign of how deep and layered the frog rain system really is. There are modifiers, exceptions, family rules. Honestly, it's more complex than modern meteorology in some ways, and twice as charming. That night, the frogs start again. But this time, I don't just hear them. I listen. There's a rhythm to it. A pulsing, layered sound like a conversation happening just beyond your understanding. The tones rise and fall with the wind. Some croaks are sharp, almost mechanical. Others are long and warbling. Together, they blend into a soundscape that's somehow trustworthy. I don't know how else to say it. It just feels like it's going to rain. The sky agrees. Around midnight it starts. A fine mist at first, then a steady drizzle.
No thunder.
No drama. Just a soft pattering on the rice shoots and thatched roofs. The frogs go wild with joy. Or maybe relief. Or maybe they're just doing what they've always done. Singing for the rain even as it falls. The next morning the world feels washed. The kind of quiet, saturated stillness that only follows a good, honest rainfall. The sky is the color of soft linen. The paddies glisten. Earthworms twist lazily on stones, and the frogs, bless them, have finally gone hoarse. Well, most of them. One brave little soul continues croaking from atop a thatched roof, his rubbery throat ballooning with every call like a damp balloon. He's unusually high up, and that doesn't go unnoticed. An old woman passing with a basket of sprouting barley stops beneath him, squints, and hums thoughtfully. "Hi frogs, hi floods," she says. "Hope someone moved the millet upstairs. It's only half a joke." There's a whole folklore around where frogs choose to sing from. Ground-level croaking meant minor rainfall. Roof croaking? That was cause to double-check your rafters. If a frog made it into your attic and stayed there, well, may as well prepare your paddles. These aren't just cute sayings. There's practical logic hiding in the mud here. Frogs, after all, are acutely sensitive to barometric pressure. Before big storms, their bodies respond, sometimes hours in advance. Their skin absorbs moisture more easily. Their limbs tingle. And when the air grows heavy and oxygen-rich, some species seek higher, more breathable ground. This is where things get fascinating. While Western scientists were still fiddling with mercury thermometers and trial-and-error wind vanes in the 17th century, Korean farmers were watching these frogs adjust their behavior in real time and trusting them. Not with blind faith, but with accumulated generational precision. There's even evidence that some farming clans gave frogs formal roles in their household almanacs. In one 1780 family document, a column titled Frog Movements was tracked alongside moon phases, sowing dates, and predicted floods, a kind of croak-based calendar. Still, not everyone believed the frogs. Some skeptical elders dismissed the frog croaks as emotional noise. Too changeable, too dramatic. They preferred cloud shapes, dew strength, and the sound of the wind through pine needles. But more often than not, the frog watchers won the bet. There's a particularly smug entry in a village record from Gyeongsang province, where a frog-based prediction for early July rain led to the only successful barley crop in the valley. Everyone else had waited for the traditional cloud signs. Too late. Flooded. One elderly frog believer was allegedly gifted a chicken out of respect. Not a fortune, but in 1692, that's some major poultry-based prestige. What I love most about all this is how low-tech it is. You don't need wires, telescopes, or glowing screens. Just patience, muddy feet, and ears tuned to amphibian gossip. But frog forecasting wasn't limited to summer rain. In the transitional seasons, spring into summer, summer into autumn, frog behavior was seen as a bellwether for pest outbreaks, drought conditions, even wildfires. One tale I hear from a farmer leaning on a hoe involves a choir of silent frogs who refused to sing for 2 weeks straight. Dry as old bones, he recalls. Even the frogs were holding their tongues. That year, a drought so intense the thatch roofs curled. Historians still argue whether frogs went silent because of environmental stress or if it was just coincidental timing. Some suggest that extended quiet could signal dehydration or pollution in water sources. Others think it's all exaggerated. But no one disputes the core idea. Frogs are deeply reactive to their environment. They're early warning systems with feet. Which brings us to one of the more fringe but deliciously weird tools of the time, the frog clock. Picture this. A shallow clay bowl filled with wet moss and pebbles. A frog inside. At various intervals throughout the day, someone would record whether the frog croaked, where it sat, and how many times it kicked its back legs when gently poked with a reed. Yes, poked. Gently. The pattern, apparently, could forecast weather for the next 6 hours. One entry from a sleepy riverside village shows a full 30-day chart of frog reactions, complete with doodles of their positions and increasingly dramatic interpretations. Sample line. Frog refuses to move at all. Forecast. Fog or familial betrayal. Now that's a mood. Modern biologists chuckle at this, of course. But even they admit, frogs are phenomenally responsive creatures. And ancient Korean farmers had centuries to figure that out. But it wasn't just about what frogs did. It was when they did it. Timing mattered immensely. Croaking during the morning meant something different from croaking at twilight. A frog that sang during the full moon was considered more truthful than one croaking under a waxing crescent. Mating calls carried different meaning than warning chirps. Even tadpole visibility was tracked. Early hatchlings meant early storms. And if all else failed, you waited for the frog convergence. Once or twice a year, usually just before peak monsoon, hundreds of frogs would migrate en masse from hill to streambed or vice versa. These migrations were so dramatic they were considered events. Children followed them. Farmers watched them. Shamans danced beside them. One account from the early 1800s describes a frog migration so massive that roads were closed and ox carts rerouted. The villagers took it as a sign of sky weeping. 2 days later, the heaviest downpour in 20 years began. Now, modern herpetologists will tell you this is likely triggered by synchronized breeding patterns. The frogs gather to spawn and feed, prompted by environmental cues. But to the ancient mind, it was the earth itself organizing a ceremony. And the message was clear. Something's coming. Something wet. That night, the frogs fall into a soft, staggered rhythm. Not frantic. Not urgent. Just steady. Like background percussion to a dream you can't quite remember. A lullaby from creatures that don't care if you understand them, only that you listen. And in this village, listening is survival. By the time the third night rolls around, the frogs are putting on an absolute opera. They've positioned themselves with such odd specificity, on clay rooftops, fence posts, even inside a disused sandal left near the edge of a stream, that I start to suspect we're the ones being observed. I sit beneath a lantern swaying from a wooden beam, trying to count the number of overlapping croaks. It's impossible, like trying to track raindrops on a lake. But I do notice something curious. Their rhythm is shifting. It's no longer a flat repetition. There's a rolling quality to it now, a rise and fall in intervals, somewhat like a tide. And that's not just poetic. It's part of the method. Welcome to the full frog forecasting toolkit. You see, ancient Korean farmers weren't just listening for noise. They were analyzing, tuning in, decoding, comparing croak cycles from different parts of the village. It was almost like amateur radio, except instead of stations you had irrigation ditches. Instead of DJs, frogs. The method had 4 main elements. First, croak frequency. Rapid-fire chirping often preceded short bursts of rain. Slow, rhythmic calls meant sustained, gentle showers. If the frogs croaked irregularly, long pauses, inconsistent bursts, it was taken as a warning of unstable skies or high winds. Second, mating calls. Mating season in frogs overlaps with early monsoon in Korea, usually around May to June. If the frogs started their courtship songs earlier than expected, farmers adjusted their calendars. They might plant early, repair rooftops faster, or begin preserving foods ahead of time. Third, humidity sensitivity. Frogs' porous skin absorbs moisture from the air. In drier conditions, they stay submerged and silent. But when the air thickens, even slightly, they emerge and vocalize. The more frogs you heard singing from exposed spots, like footpaths or rooftops, the more saturated the air was, and the higher the chance of rain. Fourth, hopping behavior. Yes, even how a frog moved was read like a sacred text. A frog hopping uphill meant heavy rain. Downhill meant safe conditions. Erratic, zigzagging jumps suggested confusion in the weather itself. A storm in flux, perhaps, or changing wind systems. One farmer I spoke to compared it to watching clouds walk on legs. Modern researchers examining this body of knowledge have found surprising overlaps with actual meteorological data. In one small study from the 1990s, rural farmers using frog observation correctly predicted rain patterns with 67% accuracy, far higher than chance. Still, historians argue about where this knowledge came from. Was it simply trial and error passed down over generations? Or did certain shamans or astrologers formalize it into teachings that were lost to time? There's no consensus, only fragments. Fragments like a 17th century weather journal that reads, "The frogs call in chorus, then scatter. 2 days rain, 1 clear." Or a wooden tablet inscribed with the phrase, "The sky climbs when the frog sings to his brother." Even the royal court got involved, especially during particularly volatile agricultural years. Some astrologers observed frogs in tandem with cloud movements and lunar alignments, hoping to marry the empirical with the divine. And in rare cases, it worked spectacularly. One famous story from 1711 tells of a devastating drought across southern Korea. Royal emissaries brought gifts to appease river spirits, and astrologers scoured the stars, but nothing worked. Then a peasant woman, known locally for her frog reading, was invited to court. She requested 3 frogs from her village pond. For 2 days, she watched them in a shaded garden enclosure. Then she announced, "Wait 6 nights. The rain will arrive from the east." And it did. Rain poured on the 7th morning. Was it a lucky guess?
Divine intervention?
Observational genius? Historians don't agree. But the frogs were given a shrine in her village. And to this day, that region still has an annual Frog Lantern Festival honoring the event. If that doesn't count as peer-reviewed weather science, I don't know what does. Back in our little village, the frogs continue their evening ritual. The lanterns dim. A slight mist curls off the stream. Somewhere nearby, a grandmother is humming a lullaby that, if I'm honest, sounds a lot like a frog croak smoothed into melody. She tells me her mother used to lull her to sleep with this song during long, rainy summers. "So you learn to love the sound of rain before you ever feel it," she says. "The frogs teach you that." I believe her. It's easy to think of frogs as background, wet props in a green landscape. But once you start listening, really listening, they become voices, guides. Their song is never exactly the same. Flexes, bends, adapts, speaks in rhythm, not words. And somehow it tells the truth, which is more than I can say for most weather apps. As I lie down near the edge of the field, frogs chirping in stereo around me, I feel the tension of the day unravel. Their song isn't loud now, just consistent, predictable in its unpredictability. And the night air smells like the prelude to another rain. You don't need a barometer for that. Just a few thousand tiny forecasters, croaking in harmony. By dawn, the rain has come and gone again. Just a whisper of moisture, a brush of cool on the leaves. The frogs are still, maybe dreaming, maybe just politely resting their vocal cords after what could only be described as an all-night amphibian symposium. This is the moment the farmers call the listening hour. Before the birds start, before the tools clink, before the sun finds its confidence. I follow an elder named Mun down a narrow path, flanked by slippery flagstones and mossy walls. He walks slowly, one hand behind his back, the other holding a folded piece of linen like it might suddenly turn into something. We stop at a shallow basin carved into rock, filled with rainwater and, of course, 3 frogs floating lazily at the surface. Mun nods at them, almost as if greeting co-workers. "Third day. Same 3, he mutters. I look closer. Sure enough, they're in the same order they were yesterday. One bobbing by a fern root, one near the spout, one perched on the edge like he owns the whole basin. Mun points with the linen. "That one there," he says. He likes to go quiet when it's going to clear. The frog in question doesn't move. He's either a genius or a pebble in disguise. Mun smiles. "See? Not talking. That's a forecast." This is where things take a subtle turn, from frogs as warning bells to frogs as tempo setters. It's no longer just about whether rain is coming. It's about when to start preparing, when to rest, when to fertilize, when to move seed from storage to shade. Because once planting season has passed, frog signals don't stop being relevant. They evolve. They become the slow, rhythmic heartbeat of the growing calendar. And farmers follow them. This period, post-planting, pre-harvest, is where timing becomes everything. Too much water and the roots drown. Too little and the seedlings crisp up like old paper. So the frogs become maintenance monitors. Their activity or inactivity signals whether the weather is holding, shifting, or going rogue. One tradition I learn about involves hanging small frog-shaped charms, usually carved from bamboo or made from folded reed, on the outer beams of the house. These charms weren't decorations. They were early warning indicators. When the wind picked up or changed direction, the charms would rotate, shift, or even fall. Children were taught to listen for their clatter as carefully as for the frogs themselves. If a frog charm fell and the frogs stopped croaking that night, the villagers would gather to reinforce the paddies and pull water lines back from the hills. Historians still debate the origins of these charms, whether they were tied to shamanistic practice or developed purely for agricultural use. What's more likely is that it was both. In pre-modern Korea, daily life wasn't neatly divided into sacred and mundane. It all blurred together: weather, worship, planting, superstition. You prayed with the same tools you used to dig a trench. Back in Mun's garden, a soft thumping draws our attention. A frog, smaller than a plum, greener than envy, is hopping in place on a flat rock. Not moving forward, just hopping, up and down, like he's trying to shake off a thought. Mun watches with narrowed eyes. "That's nervous jumping," he says. "Tells you it'll be windy tonight." I stifle a laugh. Or maybe he's just stressed. Mun chuckles. "Same thing. This is the joy of the frog system. It's practical but never humorless. No one here claims it's infallible. They joke when the frogs lie or oversleep. They groan when frogs predict a storm and nothing happens. But they never stop listening. And, frankly, they trust the frogs more than anything else." One midwife in the next village over reportedly delayed travel for 3 days because the frogs wouldn't bless the path. That's the phrase she used. When asked why, she simply said, "They're singing low. That means the hills are wet and waiting." And she wasn't wrong. A mudslide closed the mountain road the very next morning. Another layer to all this is how frog signals vary by region. In the southern islands, where humidity is higher, frogs croak differently. Louder, less often. In the cooler, mountainous provinces, Frogs begin singing later in the year but often with greater intensity, possibly to make up for the shorter mating window. Farmers from one region visiting another would often consult local frog guides, or simply ask the children, "What do your frogs say here?" Was a genuine question of meteorological interest. Even today, remnants of this tradition linger. Elderly villagers still call in to local radio shows during the rainy season to report unusual frog behavior. Some provinces host frog festivals where children compete in croak mimicry, and rural school textbooks from the 1950s featured frog illustrations in the weather chapters. Still, the institutional knowledge is fading. Urbanization, climate shifts, habitat loss. It's all contributing to a world where frog songs are more rare and more ignored. But in this little valley, you'd never know. The frogs are everywhere, singing, hopping, hiding, occasionally launching themselves into buckets by mistake. They are woven into the soundscape, not separate from it, as present as wind or firewood smoke. And that's the secret. The frogs don't shout. They suggest. They hint. They murmur. They croak just enough to remind you that weather isn't a thing you check. It's a thing you live with, sleep beside, eat under, pray through. A sound of warning sometimes, but just as often a lullaby. By now, I've started recognizing some of the frogs by face. Not that they look all that different, at least not to the untrained eye, but certain ones just have presence. One has a lazy, lopsided posture like he's half dissolved into the stone he sits on. Another keeps positioning himself on the lip of a cooking pot outside a kitchen door, like he's hoping for leftovers. The villagers don't just recognize them, they name them. "That one's Big Shin," a girl says, pointing to a squat, mud-splattered fellow with a crooked toe. "He always sings when it's going to thunder." And sure enough, the moment the clouds start forming in the afternoon heat, Big Shin lets out a croak that rattles through the tin of a nearby water bucket. The sound's deep and deliberate, almost smug. Big Shin, it turns out, is famous in this village. He's been forecasting since last spring. Nobody's sure if it's the same frog, of course, but the kids are convinced. He disappears in the dry months, reappears with the rains, and always sings first. This naming practice isn't just endearing. It's part of the broader way ancient Korean farmers personalized their environment. Everything with a pattern or rhythm was given personality. It wasn't about worship exactly. It was about familiarity. These frogs weren't mascots or myths. They were neighbors. In this way, frogs occupied a rare dual role, both practical tools and miniature folk heroes. Every village had its favorites, frogs with nicknames, quirks, patterns of prediction. Some were considered gossips, who croaked when nothing happened. Others were silent geniuses, who waited for the exact right moment. Entire planting decisions were occasionally influenced by a single well-regarded frog. One record from the late 1600s, written in the marginalia of a family almanac, reads, "The small black frog from the east pond croaked twice, then stopped. Rain came the next morning. Trust him again this year." Now, whether that small black frog was any more reliable than, say, a local grandmother with a sharp nose and a well-worn calendar is debatable. But in many households, the frogs were the calendar. Children learned to tell time by when the croaks began. Travelers scheduled departures around evening frog reports. One village storyteller told me that in her grandfather's time, newlyweds weren't allowed to spend their first night in the marital house if the frogs croaked during the ceremony. "Bad timing," she said with a wink. You see, frogs weren't merely used, they were consulted, and that reverence spilled into art too. I've seen pottery etched with frog silhouettes, sometimes alone, sometimes beneath curling clouds. Poems dedicated to their songs. Embroidery featuring frogs in staggered rows to represent the climbing rain. Even bamboo flutes carved with little frog figures at the mouthpiece, believed to enhance their tone during humid weather. But the most charming tradition? The frog song games. During the slow lull between planting and harvest, children and elders alike played a game known locally as Gagel Nori, the croak song. The rules were fluid. You sat near the frog pond after dusk and tried to match the rhythm of the frogs with hand claps, clicks, or sung syllables. It was a kind of echo game. If you matched the croaks exactly 3 times in a row, it meant you'd have a lucky season. If the frogs stopped singing, you were chosen and had to recite a rain poem or tell a weather riddle. I witnessed one of these games one night, tucked between firefly flickers and slow-cooked barley steam. An old man claps gently to a distant croak. 1, 2, pause. He gets a laugh when a frog responds with a higher-pitched squeak, like a musical rebuttal. Historians might classify this as oral tradition, or communal bonding, or proto-folkloric rhythm training. But I'd argue it's even simpler. It's people listening to nature with open hearts, and having fun with what they hear. It's easy to forget how much silence modern life has squeezed out of our routines. Here, where frogs still sing, there's a kind of permission granted. You don't have to fill every quiet space with your own voice. The frogs are happy to help, and maybe they're better at it. One scholar I spoke with described the frog system as a rural feedback loop, where human behavior shaped frog habitats, and frog behavior shaped human decision-making. It was a conversation, not a command. You watched how your farming patterns influenced the ponds, and how the health of the ponds changed the frog's behavior. Kept things mutual, balanced. This is something modern ecologists are just now catching up with. The idea that amphibians are bioindicators. If frogs disappear, it's a warning. If they thrive, the system is healthy. For ancient Koreans, that wasn't a hypothesis. It was a daily truth. So when Big Shin croaks at the base of a gourd trellis, someone sprinkles water around the roots. Not because the frog said so exactly, but because in some roundabout way he did. And that's the beauty of it. You're not obeying a frog. You're responding to a world that's talking back. It's a few days later and the frogs are quiet again, but not in the way that makes people nervous. This time, the silence feels earned. Like the final act of a long play, when the curtain falls and the audience leans back, full and satisfied. The rains came as predicted, soft, measured, perfect for the rice paddies. No surprise flooding, no cracked earth. Just enough to sink the roots and stir the scent of green into the air. The farmers are calm. Even the roosters seem smug. And the frogs? They're lounging. Some float on lily pads like they've taken up meditation. Others perch in the mud with legs stretched out at ridiculous angles, bellies facing the sun. Not a single croak. Not even a throat puff. It's like the entire amphibian population has taken a collective spa day. This phase is known as the frog rest. Not an official term, perhaps, but it's what the villagers call it, and it comes with its own set of meanings. To the farmers, the frog rest is a sign that the rain cycle has balanced. The water has arrived, the soil has absorbed it, and the air no longer demands attention. It's a return to normal, the lull between acts. But even this pause carries weight. A too early rest from the frogs? It might mean interrupted rains. A longer, unnatural quiet? A warning of late-season drought. The timing of their silence is just as important as the songs that came before. It's like frog jazz. The pauses are part of the message. Today, I join a grandmother named Hyen as she does her daily check of the garden. It's more ritual than necessity. She's already weeded, watered, and even whispered to the ginseng. But the frogs? She still checks. They always leave clues, she tells me, brushing aside a leaf to reveal 2 little frogs napping side by side. Look at them. Not hiding, not clumped together. That means the breeze will stay mild. She pauses, then lifts a finger. But if they'd piled up like spoons in a bowl? That's wind. Sudden gusts. Bad for millet. I have to laugh. Spoons in a bowl? She grins. Frogs no comfort. And they don't crowd unless the sky's stirring. It's not even the strangest frog body reading I've heard this week. There are beliefs about which direction a frog faces while sleeping. East-facing means warmth is coming. There are old proverbs about the spacing between their toes, the size of the air bubbles in their pond, even the way their skin reflects moonlight. One tale I hear from a local woodcutter involves a frog with a crescent-shaped scar on its back who only croaked during solar eclipses. He called it moonback, and swore it predicted the birth of his son. Is that scientifically testable? No. Is it weirdly wonderful? Absolutely. And it all fits into this broader truth. Frogs were observed. Closely, affectionately, obsessively. Like little meteorological monks living free of rent in rice fields. But what happens when they go missing? This is a question I didn't expect to linger in the air. Yet it does, whispered in the pauses between frog calls, tucked into half-finished stories. Everyone here seems to remember at least one year when the frogs didn't sing, or sang late, or sang too early and vanished. These were bad years. Drought years. Sickness years. Years when predictions failed and planting fell out of rhythm. One man, over tea, tells me about a season when even the loud frogs died. That's how he phrases it.
No fanfare.
Just quiet grief. In many cases, the cause was natural predators, disease, sudden frost. But sometimes people blamed human error. A poorly timed festival. A burned offering forgotten. Or, more controversially, a child who had caught too many frogs and tied strings around their legs for fun. Frogs, after all, weren't invincible. They were respected but also vulnerable. In fact, there was a local custom, part law, part superstition, that forbade children from catching frogs after sunset during planting season. Not because the frogs were sacred, per se, but because catching them was believed to interfere with the messages they were trying to deliver. If a frog was croaking and you silenced it, that was like hanging up on the sky mid-sentence. Of course, there were skeptics. Every village had them. The quiet uncle who rolled his eyes when someone mentioned frog omens. The headman who swore by cloud patterns instead. But even the skeptics listened. Maybe not out of belief, but out of habit. Or maybe, deep down, they didn't want to be the one who ignored a warning and doomed the crops. It's like wearing your seatbelt on a short drive. Just in case. As the day warms, I return to the edge of the stream. The frogs are still quiet, their pond dappled in leaf shadows and glints of sun. But then, just when I'm about to turn away, a single note sounds. A low, uncertain croak. Then silence again. It's not an announcement, not a warning, just a frog clearing its throat, perhaps, or testing the air. Still, the sound turns heads. A child nearby perks up. A dog pauses mid-scratch. The old woman from before whispers. That's a weather wrinkle. Not a storm. Just a reminder. And in this village, reminders matter. You don't need alarms or alerts.
No buzzing phones. No radar maps.
Just a moment of pause. A frog speaking softly. And a village that knows how to listen. By now, I've learned not to question where the frogs will appear next. This morning, one is sitting on top of a folded shirt hanging from a bamboo drying rack. He's perfectly still, almost sculptural, like someone's misplaced a paperweight with legs. I stare at him. He stares back. We share an unspoken agreement not to overthink it. A nearby child glances up and says, completely unbothered, he's just airing out. Apparently, this is normal. In fact, frogs taking elevated positions on laundry, tool handles, or fence posts was said to be a sign of long sky. That is, prolonged clear weather. When the frogs climbed high and stayed dry, so would everything else. The logic. If they aren't afraid of getting soaked, you probably shouldn't be either. Of course, not every frog agrees. Some remain tucked in shaded pond corners, half buried, like introverts politely opting out of the week's forecast. This variation, some frogs croaking, others silent, some climbing, others hiding, is where interpretation becomes art. And in Korean folk tradition, there's always someone who becomes the frog reader of a household, often a grandparent, occasionally a middle child, almost always someone who spends more time watching than speaking. In our case, it's a quiet teenager named Seo-jin, thin as a rice stalk, always barefoot, usually carrying a battered sketch pad. He doesn't say much, but he draws everything: the frogs, the rain, the footprints they leave on flat rocks. His family trusts his instincts. If Seo-jin says the frogs are uneasy, they postpone travel. If he says they're expecting company, they tie up the irrigation gates. Once, he predicted a 3-day fog just from how the frogs were avoiding the stone paths. No one laughs at Seo-jin. That's the remarkable thing here. There's room for people who notice things. He shows me a sketch from 2 nights ago. 5 frogs arranged in a near-perfect spiral, noses pointed outward like compass points. Underneath, he's written, "They're watching something we can't hear." That's the kind of sentence that sticks to your ribs. Some historians believe this observational culture, the act of truly noticing animals in their rhythms, may have roots as deep as Korea's Neolithic farming communities. Frog bones appear in several archaeological digs not just as refuse, but as possible ritual tools or omens. In one burial site, frog figurines were arranged around a child's grave, their mouths open, as if singing. Were they meant as guides, guardians, weather charmers? Historians still argue, but the presence is clear. Frogs have been speaking into Korean history for thousands of years, and every region gave them slightly different roles. In the southwest, they were considered guardians of water. In the northeast, messengers of mist. In island communities, frogs were believed to carry news from other villages via underground streams, an adorable logistical system, if wildly inefficient. But the shared thread was trust. Not blind belief but relationship, which is why when the frogs behaved strangely, croaking midday, climbing roofs, vanishing during rain, people didn't dismiss it. They paid attention. They worried. There's an old saying carved above a farmhouse door near here: if the frogs break rhythm, bind the roof. Meaning, even if you don't know why they're acting differently, take it seriously. I witnessed one of these breaks myself just before dusk. The frogs have been mostly silent all afternoon, not unusual after a rain-soaked week. But then, for no clear reason, they all begin croaking at once. Loud.
Urgent.
Not the playful chirps of evening flirtation, but something deeper, complicated. Seo-jin stands up from where he's sketching and says, simply, "Not a storm, something bigger." An hour later, the wind shifts, not violently but incorrectly. The usual soft southern breeze suddenly snaps eastward, bringing with it a dry, static charge that seems to surprise even the birds. The air feels itchy, and the frogs, they stop croaking mid-note, just gone. Silence like a curtain drop. Villagers look at one another. They don't panic, but the older ones gather the children indoors. A woman ties back the plum tree branches. Someone quietly rolls a cartload of firewood under shelter. No official decree.
No formal announcement.
Just response. It's not until much later, curled in the corner of a quiet room lit only by amber oil lamp glow, that I realize what I'm witnessing. This isn't just superstition. It's weather literacy. These people are fluent in an entirely different dialect of climate, one shaped by croaks, silences, foot traffic across mud, how high the frogs climb, how low they fall. It's not infallible, but neither is radar. And it works. Later, lightning streaks the sky, not overhead, but distant, like a warning shot. Rain doesn't arrive, but something passes through, a dry squall maybe, pressure event. Enough to tilt the weather, but not enough to drown it. The next morning begins like a slow exhale. The air is cooler, touched by something that feels like recovery. The light filters down through the pine trees in long golden beams, as if the sky itself is finally relaxing. And the frogs? They are singing again, but not the storm alarm croaks from before. No, this is the gentle cadence of what villagers call the thank you chorus. A post-disturbance lullaby. Not every frog joins in, but the ones that do sound content. Like they've aired their grievances and now just want to enjoy the morning dew. Children chase each other between the paddies. Adults sweep porches and tighten thatch bundles. Life resumes, but always with one ear tilted toward the ponds. This is the pattern here. Listen, respond, resume. Today, I join a group of farmers who've taken it upon themselves to chart the frog behavior alongside their weather logs. They've been doing it for years. Some of the notebooks date back to the 1940s. Worn covers, faded ink, pages dotted with doodles of frogs in hats or balancing umbrellas. One entry reads, April 12th, frogs sang in the morning. By evening, for clouds stacked like rice cakes, planted sweet root early. Wise choice. Another, less confident. Frogs sang, then stopped. We guessed wrong. Chickens refused to leave coop. Grandmother said we should have listened to the hens. What I find most fascinating is how the frog observations are always included, even when they contradict the day's decisions. There's no erasing the frogs. If anything, the farmers are more willing to doubt themselves than to doubt their amphibious advisors. It's a subtle humility, one that doesn't pretend to control the weather, just interpret it as best as possible with help. And the frogs help, not just in forecasting but in creating rhythm, emotional rhythm. A woman named Sukjin tells me she listens to the frogs when she can't sleep. Not because they soothe her, though they do, but because she thinks they remember things she forgets. They're ancient, she says, and small, so people don't expect them to matter. But they do. If they croak, I feel better, even if I don't know why. She's not alone. Several of the villagers admit to using frogs as emotional weather vanes. If the frogs are croaking, the world feels orderly. If they're silent, unease creeps in. Even those who claim not to believe still find themselves noticing. A teenager who rolls his eyes at his grandmother's frog calendar will still pause if the frogs all go quiet mid-game. He may not say anything, but he'll glance at the sky, and sometimes that glance is enough. This connection, this mutual awareness, extends into the language itself. The Korean word for frog, garegiri, pops up in dozens of old idioms, lullabies, and rural proverbs. A frog in the well cannot see the ocean, goes one saying, a warning against narrow thinking. Another compares a boastful person to a frog singing before the rain, implying premature celebration. But here, in this quiet valley, the idioms are softer. The frog croaks, and the earth listens. A sleeping frog dreams of clouds. Frogs sing truth to the wind. These aren't slogans. They're reminders to slow down, to listen, to believe that meaning can come from the smallest, wettest corners of life. And this respect is passed down. Children here are taught frog etiquette almost as early as table manners. No catching frogs without asking. No disturbing their pond during rain. No pointing at them unless you're prepared to interpret their silence. Some of this sounds silly, until you realize it's all about observation. It's about raising a generation that notices before reacting, that pauses, that listens for more than just answers. I watch as a group of children squat beside a puddle, watching a single frog poke its nose out. No one yells. No one throws pebbles. They just wait. One finally whispers, "He's not singing today. Maybe he's tired." Another shrugs. Or maybe he's listening to us. Either way, they respect the silence. That night, over barley tea and sesame rice cakes, the villagers speak about the long view, about how frog populations are shifting, about how climate change is making the old patterns harder to read. The frogs are still singing, but the symphony is more fragile now. One elder sighs. The songs aren't as thick as they used to be, but no one's given up. If anything, they're listening harder, writing more, teaching their kids earlier, building little shelters beside the ponds. Simple things, just rocks and leaves, to give the frogs cool places to hide. And when one does sing, the whole valley hears it, not because it's loud, but because it matters. There's a hill just outside the village that people call Frog's Ear. It doesn't look like much, just a low slope dotted with wild garlic and soft grass. But the name comes from the way it seems to catch sound. Walk up there during frog season, and you'll hear every pond, every puddle, every sleepy croak from miles around, all funneling together in stereo. It's the perfect place to eavesdrop. I head there just after sundown, when the air is syrupy with heat and crickets are beginning their rehearsal. Sure enough, the frogs are already tuning up. Some quick, darting chirps, some low groans like a tiny cello section. One especially eager frog keeps starting his song early, croaking over everyone else like a kid who can't wait for his solo. It's an orchestra, a weird, damp, incredibly precise orchestra. From this vantage, I realize something important. These croaks aren't just random noise. They overlap, sure, but they rarely collide. There's an odd respect to the way frogs space their calls, as if they're passing messages down a line, not competing for the loudest seat. And villagers hear that too. A woman named Jinkyung once told me, when the frogs overlap in twos, it means the wind will stay in the valley. But if they answer in threes, the weather's leaving town. I didn't understand it at the time, but now, listening from this hillside, I hear it. Two croaks, pause, two more, another from far away. A rhythm, then a break. Three distinct croaks from different directions. Maybe the wind's packing its bags. This is the final phase in the frog calendar cycle, the part where their songs aren't just predicting rain or sun but giving shape to the in-between days. The moments when nothing dramatic is happening, and the weather is simply adjusting, rebalancing. Farmers rely on these subtle cues for the tasks that fall between the big ones. When to retie bamboo trellises, when to thin out the rice shoots, when to gather mountain herbs before they grow bitter. The frogs tell them. And if the frogs stop for a whole day, that's your cue to rest too. This might be my favorite thing about the frog wisdom tradition. It allows room for not acting, for stillness, for listening and deciding not to plow, not to build, not to rush. In a world obsessed with doing, frogs offer the radical idea of simply being aware. One afternoon, an elderly man tells me, "The frogs don't hustle. Why should we?" I nod, pretending I've always known that. There's even an old proverb about this, one that isn't well known outside of farming circles. The frog does not leap before his shadow, meaning, wait until you've seen yourself clearly in the stillness before you jump. And as odd as it sounds, that philosophy seems to shape everything around here. The villagers don't rush to conclusions. They let the weather speak. They let the frogs interrupt. It's a kind of environmental patience, one that includes animals in the decision-making process. Historians who study traditional Korean agriculture sometimes label this reactive adaptation, but that feels too clinical. It's more like a friendship, or a soft agreement. One day, the frogs croak louder and earlier than usual. Not urgent, just energetic. It's not raining. There's no change in the wind, but the whole valley feels charged. So the villagers hold a small night festival. Not a big thing, just a few lanterns, a communal pot of seaweed broth, some shared rice cakes shaped like lily pads. Kids draw frogs in the dirt. Elders hum old songs. One man plays a flute that sounds exactly like a distant bullfrog with a head cold. When I ask why they're celebrating, a woman shrugs and says, "The frogs are in a good mood. We should match them."
No prediction. No harvest milestone.
Just a sense of shared optimism with their amphibious neighbors. Honestly, it works. The whole evening feels lighter, like the earth is humming underfoot. At one point, someone asks a young boy to tell the weather by listening. He stands very still, closes his eyes and says, "The frogs are laughing. It's going to be a funny week." Everyone laughs, but no one disagrees, because here laughter is weather, and frogs apparently forecast both. It's early morning again, the kind where everything is tinted blue and smells faintly of wet earth. The frogs are quiet, too quiet for comfort, but no one seems worried. Today isn't about prediction. It's about gratitude. I follow a path that winds past 3 small ponds, each carefully maintained with low stone walls and trickling irrigation canals. At the farthest one, a family is gathered. Parents, a grandfather, 2 children, and a dog that has absolutely no respect for silence. They've come for what they call the frog offering. Not an offering to the frogs necessarily. There's no incense, no chanting. Just a simple practice. The family lays out a bowl of barley water, a few crushed sweet potatoes, and a sprig of mugwort beside the pond. Then they sit. They don't speak. They just wait. "Why mugwort?" I whisper to the grandfather. He grins. "Because it's bitter. We give the frogs a little bitterness so the rest of our year tastes sweet." There's something oddly moving about it. Not religious, not transactional. Just an annual gesture of thanks to creatures who have no idea they've helped orchestrate a village's entire planting season. But even so, a frog appears. Small, pale green, with a smudge on one leg like it's been chalked. It hops over to the edge of the offering and sits motionless, staring into the barley water like it's about to deliver a toast. The children are enchanted. "See," their mother says, "they always come when we mean it." Historians might classify this as seasonal folk ritual, an animist remnant woven into practical farming life. But no one here is trying to preserve it in a museum case. They're just living it. Quietly, repeatedly, like breathing. There's even a phrase they use, "Listen, then thank." It applies to frogs, of course, but also to elders, to weather, to each other. A culture of response over reaction. A rhythm of relationship. And you begin to see it everywhere. A woman sweeping her yard pauses to move a frog from the step before she continues. A boy delays his game of top spinning because the frogs by the stream are unusually active, and he doesn't want to scare them into silence. A baker hangs his sourdough to rise near the window, because he believes the frogs sing better when bread is nearby. That last one is definitely personal superstition. But still, it's all connected. Even local songs reflect this reverence. I come across an old lullaby sung by a woman carding wool near her door. The lyrics, gently hummed, translate roughly to, "Frog on the lotus leaf, tell me where the rain will sleep. If it sleeps beyond the hill, I will wait and weed until. If it dreams beneath my tree, I will plant a row of tea." It doesn't matter if the frogs actually understand. What matters is that they appear to listen. and in doing so teach the people to listen too, not just to croaks, to silence, to shifts in the air, to what the land is whispering when it isn't yelling. This is a different kind of intelligence, one that doesn't demand control or prediction, but accepts signs as subtle invitations, an invitation to prepare, to pause, or simply to pay attention. And the frogs, they keep issuing those invitations, day after day, season after season. Sometimes, in return, the villagers carve tiny frog sculptures out of soapstone or wood and place them near windows, not to ward off anything, just to remember, to remind themselves that this was a good year, and that the frogs helped it be so. In one home, I see a frog carving placed on a bookshelf between a worn seed almanac and a cracked jar of preserved plums. The homeowner tells me, "He's the quietest one, so I keep him where we argue the most." I raise an eyebrow. She laughs. The frog listens, even when we don't. Such a simple thought, such a generous metaphor, and yet it's at the heart of this entire way of life. Not domination, not data, just the humility to say, maybe the frog knows something I don't. And even if it doesn't, listening to it still teaches you how to listen better to everything else, which really might be the best kind of wisdom there is. It's nearly the end of the season now. The rice paddies have grown thick and golden, their stalks bending in slow waves beneath the weight of grain and wind. The sky has softened, less drama, more haze, and the frogs, well, they're quieter. Not gone, just less performative. A few gentle chirps at dusk. A single bellow at midnight that sounds like someone turning over in their sleep. This is the tapering off phase, known locally as frog folding. It's not a scientific term, of course, but that's what the villagers call it, when the frogs gradually retreat into smaller roles. They sing less, they wander less, their circles shrink to shade and shallow water. They're folding themselves back into the world, one elder says, folding laundry as she speaks. Like origami, but wetter. It's poetic, yes, but it's also practical. With the weather growing cooler and the nights longer, the frogs begin preparing for torpor, an amphibian version of hibernation. They'll bury themselves in mud or disappear into mossy cracks, lowering their metabolic rate to match the slowness of the earth. Some villagers say they dream through the winter, of rain, of clouds, of drums made from thunder. Others believe they stay alert, whispering in their sleep, adjusting the future weather with every muddy breath. And so, even as their presence fades, the frogs remain important. There's a specific ritual performed in some regions of Korea around this time, the Byinggi, or frog farewell gathering. It's not universal, more common in mountain villages than coastal ones, but its structure is always the same. An evening meal shared near the frog ponds, with empty bowls laid out for the guests who cannot attend. Children sing the first frog song they heard that season. Elders tell stories, some real, some wildly embellished, about the most memorable croaks. Someone inevitably tries to impersonate the frogs and fails, resulting in choking laughter and spilled barley tea. And then, everyone goes quiet. The farewell isn't spoken aloud. It's just felt. A pause. A shared understanding that the chorus is over, and the quiet is about to deepen. That night, I attend one of these gatherings. I'm handed a bowl of roasted chestnuts and told to chew slow, so the frogs can hear, which I do, as reverently as possible, despite the slight crunchiness. A little girl sits beside me and asks, very seriously, "Do frogs get cold?" I consider the question. Before I can answer, her grandfather leans in and says, "Only if we forget to remember them." Such a simple line, but it feels weighted. In this village, remembering is a kind of warmth. And that's the whole point of the farewell, to keep the frogs held in memory as they disappear from sight. to honor their role not just as weather watchers or rain singers, but as seasonal companions, creatures who reminded the villagers when to act and when to wait, when to speak and when to simply listen. I notice that even as the frog songs diminish, other sounds are allowed to grow. The rustle of broomcorn in the wind, the creak of oxcart wheels, the hum of low fires as they burn through the last of the gathered pine branches. The village shifts its soundscape. The frogs have done their part. Now it's time for the world to carry the rhythm without them, until spring. Still, the frogs don't vanish all at once. You'll catch a straggler here or there, a late croak from the shadows, or a splash in a quiet corner. And each time it feels like a secret, a final word left behind, a tiny note scrawled at the bottom of a weathered letter. Don't forget me. I won't, because by now, I've realized something important. The frogs were never just about the rain, or the crops, or even the weather. They were about the practice of paying attention. They were nature's quiet insistence that you stop, listen, and allow the world to reveal its intentions, one muddy footstep at a time. And even as they tuck themselves away, the habits they've shaped remain. A boy still pauses before jumping into a stream, listening for the frog's approval. A woman still decides not to dry her herbs too close to the pond, just in case one final croak signals incoming moisture. An old man stops mid-task and simply looks around, hands on his knees, waiting for a sound that might or might not come. This isn't folklore. It's a relationship, one that spans seasons, generations, and the space between sound and silence. The frogs are folding away for the year, but the village still listens. And that, I think, is what matters most. The first frost kisses the tops of the paddies like a shy goodbye. Thin layers of silver creep across the stone walls, and the ponds take on the stillness of held breath. It's officially too cold for frogs. You'd think their absence would be complete now, an abrupt silence, but instead, it's more like they've whispered themselves out of the room. The croaks didn't stop all at once. They tapered, dwindled, softened into memory, like a campfire that burns down to a glow you can still warm your hands by. And yet, in some strange way, they're still here. You see it in the way people hesitate before stepping on a puddle, or how they lean toward the pond even though they know no one's singing anymore. There's an echo in the stillness, a pattern people keep tuning into out of habit, affection, and maybe just a little longing. I walk the village paths one last time before winter fully settles in. The earth is firmer now. The sky wears a permanent gray, and smoke drifts in lazy spirals from chimneys. Everything has slowed. But the frogs, those unlikely little meteorologists, have left behind a season's worth of clues. Their last croaks were recorded, mentally or literally, by nearly everyone in the village. C.O. Jean, the teenage sketch artist, has filled the final pages of his notebook with frog diagrams and weather annotations, complete with goofy titles like Sir Croaksalot's Final Forecast. His grandmother reads them like scripture. In the schoolhouse, a group of children takes turns acting out frog behavior for a classroom weather game. If one child croaks twice and hides, the others have to guess what it means. 2 croaks and a dive? Late fog after moonrise. They're shockingly accurate. These rituals don't die with the season. They deepen. I'm invited to one more tradition before I leave. Something called the mud memory jar. Each household writes down a single observation from the past frog season. Anything from the frogs sang during the rainbow, to 3 frogs slept under the millet crate, and buries it in a sealed clay jar by the pond. Next year, after the frogs return, they'll dig it up, read each note aloud, and compare it to what actually happened. Not to test accuracy, just to remember, to see what was noticed, what was missed, and what the frogs may have been trying to say all along. And as I help press the final jar into its resting place, I realized that what makes all this so powerful isn't whether frogs can really predict the weather. It's that this village lets them try. It gives them space to matter. It makes room for something soft, uncertain, and wonderfully weird to guide decisions that are deeply human. When to plant, when to rest, when to laugh under lanterns, and when to go inside and close the shutters. There's a gentleness to that worldview. A quiet discipline that says, not everything that matters needs to be measured. Some things just need to be heard. And so, with boots muddied and hands cold, I walk away from the last frog pond of the year. Behind me, the village hums its winter tune. Firewood stacking, soup boiling, while being stitched into something warm. Ahead, the path curves toward the ridge. The wind carries a faint rustle. A breeze or maybe something more? I pause, just for a second, just in case. But no, the frogs have folded away. Their song has ended. Until spring. So now, with the frogs tucked into mud beds and the weather quiet once more, we leave the rice paddies behind. Let the sounds of the story soften into your breath. The slow croaks fading into still air, the rustle of straw roofs, the hush of water finding its way home. You've walked the muddy paths. You've knelt beside the pond, watching the frogs dream under moonlight. You've listened to a world that moves in rhythms we often miss. Tonight, you've lived a season alongside people who believed that something small and slippery might be telling the truth about the sky. And whether or not you believe in frog forecasts, maybe it's enough to know that someone did. That entire fields were planted based on a single well-timed croak. That laughter and fear, patience and action, all flowed from the same muddy choir. And that maybe, just maybe, it's okay to slow down and listen even if the message is unclear. So as you lie still now, let your mind drift like mist over the paddies. Let your breath match the rhythm of a frog's soft pulse beneath the soil. Let the silence hold you gently, like warm mud cradling a small green body through winter. The frogs are quiet, and so now are you. Sweet dreams.